Excellent. Well, welcome everybody. I'm Bonnie from the Blackstone River Valley National Heritage Corridor. We're very pleased to partner with the Blackstone River Valley National Historical Park in bringing you this year's winter lecture series, Revolution in the Air. Today we have a very special guest, Dr. Manisha Sinha from the University of Connecticut, and she'll be speaking with us today about slavery, abolition, and the rise of industrial capitalism. We'll follow up with this lecture. There will be a recording posted to YouTube on the Blackstone River Valley National Historical Park's Facebook page and YouTube, and we'll be sharing that. In addition, we'll be sending out a follow-up email with a survey to give feedback about this lecture series. So thank you all for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you
for that introduction, and thank you to the National Park Service and the Blackstone River Valley Historical Site for hosting me today. And thank you all of you for coming here on a Saturday morning to listen to me. As Bonnie said, I'm going to be talking about the connections between slavery, abolition, and industrial capitalism. I'm a historian of the long 19th century, and I have studied quite a bit and written about slavery and the history of abolition and the Civil War and Reconstruction. So I'm going to share my screen with you right now. As just to, you can see my screen? Yes. I like this background, reminded me of the cotton crop for some reason. Usually when I teach this in my classes at the University of Connecticut, I get a cotton ball with me to show my students what that exactly looks like. But this is an issue that historians have talked about for a long time. We know that the rise of Western democracy and capitalism coincided with the rise of racial slavery, and then, of course, the history of European imperialism. And what exactly were the connections between the history of slavery and capitalism has been a matter of debate for a long time. And the debate, for at least in terms of the Western Hemisphere, begins with this book by Eric Williams that was published in 1944, first, called Capitalism and Slavery, where Eric Williams, who was a historian of the Caribbean, argued that the slave trade had really facilitated the rise of capitalism in Britain. And he very specifically pointed to the connections between the African slave trade that lasted nearly 4 centuries and the rise of shipping, of insurance and banking in Britain. And since Britain was the first country to undergo the Industrial Revolution, really the dates for that is from 1750 to 1850 for the British takeoff in terms of the rise of industrial capitalism and the Industrial Revolution, he was able to make this case rather convincingly. And the second part of his theory was that Britain abolished slavery only when slavery became unprofitable for the empire, and that they started concentrating more in developing capitalism, industrial capitalism, the factory system, etc., back at home. Now, this part of his theory is one that has been really challenged by historians, and I, as a historian of abolition, have also challenged that part of his theory because, in fact, when Britain abolished slavery, slavery was extremely profitable to the British Empire, and there was a lot of opposition to it. There was the West India interest, and the only way they finally abolished slavery was by compensating slaveholders for their human property, not the slaves for centuries of unpaid labor. Now, in terms of the United States, this debate had a resonance because you had historians of slavery. A lot of times, like the history of the Civil War, the history of slavery was told from a very kind of biased perspective. It was told by Southern historians who argued that slavery was a benevolent patriarchal institution, that it was more feudal than capitalist, that in fact slaveholders even took care of their enslaved property at a loss. They took care of them as feudal lords of old. This was an interpretation that was popularized by Eugene D. Genovese, who was a historian of slavery. And he argued that, of course, slavery was a bad and oppressive institution, but that somehow in the United States, we had a system that was pre-capitalist. That it was, in fact, not part of the capitalist system, like the Caribbean story that Eric Williams had written about. And Genovese argued that Brazil and the United States had this kind of seigneurial, paternalistic feudal system. And it's an interpretation that has been completely upended by historians of slavery today, who have unearthed the intricate and intimate ties between the slave economy in the South and the United States. Now, one thing that's important to remember is that when the United States became independent after the American Revolution, that slavery was legal in all 13 colonies, and that slave labor was used in in the Narragansett Valley in Rhode Island, in the Hudson Valley in New York. New York City had the largest slave population, urban slave population after Charleston, South Carolina. So it was a national institution. And then, of course, you had the plantation economies in the South, which grew staple crops based on slave labor, like sugar, in Louisiana, which eventually became part of the United States, tobacco in Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, rice in low country South Carolina and Georgia, and then of course cotton. That became the staple slave crop in the United States and took up the entire Mississippi Valley. So the ties between different American economies, regional economies, and slavery was intimate. We now know that New England was part of the system of trading that involved the West Indies, sugar, rum, slavery, and Europe too. So it's not as if slavery was a sideshow, but most of the northern states, of course, gradually abolished slavery. And you had the spread of slavery in the South, mainly coinciding with the spread of cotton cultivation. I'm sure you all have heard about the cotton gin and the invention of the cotton gin and how short staple cotton could spread through the Trans-Mississippi Valley West. And that became the crop in terms of slave labor in the United States. So even though slavery declines in the North through a system of gradual abolition, beginning with Vermont and ending with New Jersey, slavery actually expands in the South. So the idea that somehow the American Republic is founded and slavery would gradually disappear was simply not true. In fact, slavery becomes very important to the national political economy. Slave-grown cotton is the largest item of export from the United States, and its value exceeds the value of all other items of export from the United States. So it is central to the growth of the national economy. Now, slave-grown cotton, the so-called empire of cotton, is then being fed into cotton mills in Manchester, in England. It is being shipped to, precisely those factories that lead in creating the Industrial Revolution, which is textile industry. Most British economists have known that for a long time. But where is all this slave-grown cotton coming from? It is coming from the South. And it's really important to remember that, because when we think of the Industrial Revolution as a global phenomenon that involved the rise of the factory system, that involved mechanization, that involved the use of steam power, all the things that will happen in New England, in the Blackstone River Valley, and that happens earlier in Britain, and many times it's the same people who come to the United States, bringing many of these new technologies and ideas with them, that this was in fact built on the backs of slave labor, of enslaved people who are producing this cotton. And historians of slavery, especially Ed Baptist, whose book, The Half Has Never Been Told, who has mounted, I think, the most serious challenge to this older notion of slavery as a kind of benevolent, patriarchal, feudal system that had nothing to do with modernity or the rise of capitalism in this country. He really shows at a very day-to-day level the ways in which plantation economies work, on how ideas and technologies of modern economics are being used in farms and plantations all through the South, whether it's sophisticated systems of accounting, of measuring cotton, of seeing its impact in the world market, of using international systems of finance, which are simply growing at this time, to finance both the growth of cotton and its marketing. Cotton becomes the crop for the world market, and eventually it is also the engine of British imperialism, because once slavery is abolished in the South after the Civil War, Britain is looking for new suppliers of cotton, and they come to places that have grown cotton since antiquity, places like Egypt, like India, where they develop new supplies. But it continues to feed the textile system and industrial revolution in Britain. In the United States itself, within the domestic and internal economies of the United States, one can see how cotton really fed the textile mills that grew up in New England. Some of you may have been to Lowell. I was looking at where all the places that people said they were from, and I was hoping somebody was there from Lowell or from Lynn, because there you can make the direct connections. You have, slave-grown cotton, again, supplying the rise of these textile mills in the Northeast, particularly in New England. And many of them are using immigrant slave labor coming from, or not slave, sorry, wage labor coming into the United States. So this mix of the growth of industry and immigrant labor, first using actually even domestic native labor, a lot of women who of course part of the early labor force in Lowell, and they're the ones who actually formed the early labor unions and even anti-slavery societies, linking their own conditions and impressions with that of the enslaved. So one can see these connections happening between the slave South and the free North, which are always seen as kind of antagonistic, as developing different economies. But actually, if you think of this in terms of the economic history of this period, they're not so much competing as complementary. The growth of industry in the North is complementary to these plantation economies producing these staple crops in the South, and then actually they are being supplied there. They also start feeding the slave economies of the North, of the South. If you think of the theory of comparative advantages, where each region specializes on what it does best, right? And for the South, it was the staple crop cultivation, particularly cotton, on the backs of enslaved Black labor. And in the North, it was using that to produce other goods. But the North also becomes a feeder to the South. They start producing shoes, they start producing tools, etc., which feeds the Southern agrarian economy. So just like in the colonial era and the early republic, you can see ties between the New England economy and the slave economies of the Caribbean. One can see similar ties developing between the South and North. There's also the shipping industry and insurance, exactly the things that Eric Williams had talked about in terms of the growth of merchant capitalism in Britain. You have the same thing happening in New York City. Some of the biggest shipping and insurance industries are directly tied to the slave economy. And it's only recently that we have been digging up these ties. And some of these names are familiar, Aetna and other insurance companies that insured slave property and they insured, because that was the most valuable capital that slaveholders had, was in fact slave labor, interestingly enough, their ownership of enslaved people. And many of the big houses, the Lehman Brothers, for instance, that collapsed in the 2008 depression, that Lehman, he was a slave trader, began as a slave trader in the South, and eventually moved on to Wall Street. So these connections between the growth of capitalism in the United States and slavery are rather intimate and long-standing. And historians of slavery have only recently started unearthing them. And they have seen the ways in which slave traders have used systems of accounting and business practices that are completely associated with the rise of capitalism. Sophisticated financial instruments that are being traded by slave traders on Wall Street and then going on to even back to England. These circuits of capital, of financial capitalism that we associate with our modern economies, you can see those links right back to slavery. So again, that old idea that somehow the South and the North were antagonistic because they had different economies. The South was agrarian, the North was industrial. That's also not even true. On the eve of the Civil War, the North was predominantly agrarian. Industrial capitalism is a fairly new thing in the North, and it is in certain pockets and areas. The industrial takeoff in the United States does not happen until after the Civil War. The classic period for industrial capitalism takeoff in the US actually is between 1870 and 1920, well after Britain, and when it overtakes Britain as the leading industrial power in the modern world. Going on to this, let's go down to the basic level and the ways in which enslaved people fed into the growth of capitalism in this country. Now, there's a debate amongst historians over, what role exactly did slavery play? Was it the main motive force, or was it the free economies of the North, which was basically farm labor at that time, right? It was farmers. You had the factory system developing in certain urban areas, certain other areas where you had in New England, particularly where you had the growth of industrial capitalism. But for the most part, the Northern economy was based on farm labor and artisans, sometimes even owning their own shops. And that transition from farmers and artisans to wage labor takes place over a long time in the North. Here's the statistics that is worth pondering. If you were a farmer in the South, not a big planter, which is usually a person who owned more than 20 enslaved people, but if you were a farmer and you owned one enslaved person, you were richer than the average Northern farmer. You were just richer just because you had that one enslaved person who at that time were being traded as capital and as labor. This is this kind of dual nature of slavery, where enslaved people were capital, enormous capital for slaveholders. A so-called, quote, prime field hand, young male, was being sold over $1,500 to $2,000 on the eve of the Civil War. That would be worth a huge amount today. So enslaved people were valued for their labor, of course, because they were producing cotton, because they were producing these staple crops, even sugar and rice. There were grandees who, the wealthiest men in the United States, according to the US Census of 1860, were slaveholders who owned over 100, 200 slaves in Low Country, South Carolina and Louisiana. So these people were extremely powerful. They were extremely wealthy. And of course, they had a very powerful interest in the US government. Thanks to the 3/5 clause, they actually got extra representation for simply owning slaves and therefore dominated the presidency, the Senate, and the federal judiciary right up to the Civil War. But going back to this notion of how important, even, I'm going to forward here, how important the slave trade was to the economy of slavery. A lot of historians have looked particularly at the domestic slave trade of the United States because, of course, the African slave trade was abolished in 1808 as stipulated by the US Constitution. But the interstate slave trade, the domestic slave trade, really became the place where people invested, speculated, and made big bucks. This were financiers in Wall Street. There were large slave trading houses in Washington, D.C., in Alexandria, in Richmond. And they made a lot of money. A lot of banks floated by actually capitalizing in the slave trade. So it was not just slavery, but also the slave trade that abolitionists always attacked because of its inhumanity and because it replicated the horrors of the African slave trade, as you all might have seen in popular depictions. The seaborne trade, but also the ways in which even free blacks are being kidnapped into slavery because it's just so profitable to have slave labor, both as capital and as labor. Most importantly, slave women are valued because they are reproducing the slave labor force. So they are given incentives, actually. And there's been a big debate amongst historians. Did actual breeding take place in slave farm? But we know that over 100,000 slaves were sold from the upper South states to the lower South, to the Cotton Kingdom throughout the antebellum period. And this was big business. So enslaved women were actually incentivized to produce more. They were, again, used for not just the production of crops, but for the reproduction of the slave labor and of the slave system as a whole. And there have been a lot of good books on this that look at the particular ways in which enslaved women's reproductive powers were used to actually further the system of slavery. There's also been very good work that shows that white slaveholding women also did this. They participated in the slave trade, even when legally women did not have much of standing. This was a time of femme covert, where, it was men who had property and owned wages. It was very late in the 1830s and 40s that even we started having married women's property laws. But women legally did not have much standing. But recent work, especially Stephanie Jones Rogers' book, They Were Her Property, has shown how active Southern white slaveholding women were in not just slave ownership, but also in the slave trade right down to the Civil War. Now, I looked at the other side of the question. So here we see a lot of complicity between the existence of slavery and the rise of capitalism. What was this other side of the question where people said, oh, abolitionists were just bourgeois, middle class Northerners who, oppressed wage labor in their own backyards, but were, shedding these crocodile tears about the horrors of slavery. And this interpretation was extremely fashionable, even when I published my book in 2016. And I took it on head on. The book is a history of the abolition movement from the Revolution to the Civil War. But I really took it on head on in this chapter that I wrote on the Abolitionist International. And where I argued that, in fact, there was a lot more overlap between the labor movement and the abolitionist movement, and to dismiss it as some sort of bourgeois movement that was justifying wage labor by attacking slave labor is simply not true, because there was a lot of overlap sometimes between abolitionists and the early labor movement, and the ways in which abolitionists, especially in New England, thought about this opened up a whole new area of study for me. And in fact, I argue that the abolitionists were some of the early critics of the oppressions of wage labor. Though they really pushed back against this idea, and this is where the sort of competitive nature between the abolitionists and the labor movement develops, the idea that somehow wage labor in New England was more oppressed than slave labor in the South. This was an argument that some labor leaders made, and highly racist arguments sometimes. And abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison, the most preeminent of them, completely pushed back against this. He's like, I can see the oppressions of factory labor, and he wrote eloquently about that. But to say that this is worse than the oppressions that enslaved people suffer is wrong. And this is where a lot of the argument developed between labor reformers and between early abolitionists. But as I told you, there were labor leaders. I'm particularly point out to the Lowell Mill Girls, who began some of the early anti-slavery societies and some of the early trade unions. They saw the link, and they described their condition as wage slavery. And the reason why they did that was because slavery remained the benchmark of oppression in the United States, the benchmark of the worst kind of oppression of labor, where you literally enslaved labor and did not give them any fruits of their labor, right? So when labor leaders, I'm going forward here, when labor leaders adopted this notion of wage slavery, they were using the most powerful criticism that they could for their own conditions, whether it was badly lit, overcrowded factories, bad wages, being forced to work long hours, etc. They could actually use the idea of slavery, and they get that from the abolition movement, this idea of wage slavery. Most abolitionists are sympathetic to the early labor movement and to land reform, because they see it as a system of overlapping oppressions. They see the connections. They're the ones who first talk about the connections between slavery and capitalism, actually. Even though they see slavery as a regressive system, they see slavery as a system that is not particularly progressive, both in terms of economy and ideas. At the same time, they criticize it as one that exploits labor also. So there's some overlap there. There is very important sort of land reform movements led by people like George Henry Evans. He and Garrison are the only two newspaper editors in all of United States that actually praised Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831, that is deplored by everyone as this kind of violent slave rebellion. But both Garrison and George Henry Evans, who's a land reformer, defend Turner's rebellion. So the land reform movement began as kind of a solution to the oppressions of wage labor. That why don't we just send them out west, even though that of course meant dispossessing Native Americans, and give them farms. Let everyone be an independent producer. Why should anyone be a dependent wage laborer? So the land reform movement was quite popular in early America. You also had communitarian movements, like in Hopedale. You all heard about that a bit in the last session. You had movements, alternative communities. The abolitionists developed their own community in Northampton. It's the only one that allowed African Americans in. The famous Black abolitionists, David Ruggles, very important for the underground development of the Underground Railroad, and Sojourner Truth were part of that communitarian movement in Northampton. They thought of alternative economic and social arrangements to what they saw as the growing oppression oppressions of industrial capitalism. You had people who self-identified as socialist abolitionists, who attended the New England labor conventions and also the abolitionist conventions. People like William Henry Channing, the nephew of the famous William Ellery Channing, who called himself a socialist abolitionist, and said, I can't see any difference between the struggles of labor in the North and fighting against slavery in the South. And then you had, of course, the question of immigrants who were coming into the United States and who were being used then in especially in New England, in many of these early factories. And many abolitionists like Garrison thought that these people would definitely join their cause because of the historical oppressions of Ireland in the hands of the British, but also because they felt that their oppressions in the New World would lead them to be more sympathetic to the oppressions of Black people. Unfortunately, that did not happen. And part of it was the conservatism of the Catholic Church in the United States, but also because most of the Irish joined the Democratic Party, which in the 19th century was leaning heavily towards the South, was really the party of slaveholders. It's really Irish abolitionists back home in Ireland who are far more sympathetic, ironically, to the abolitionist cause than many of the Irish workers, especially because they are led sometimes by people who are very pro-slavery and racist in their ideas. And this is not true of all of them, because you had some outstanding Irish labor leaders like Patrick Ford, who actually was an apprentice for Garrison's Liberator and later became very prominent in the Irish Land League movements, etc. So there were others, but on the whole, Irish Americans tended to join the Democratic Party, and in many northern urban areas, there was more conflict between free Blacks and the Irish, wanting the same jobs, living sometimes in the same spaces, and there's a lot of competitiveness that comes. So the Irish question becomes complicated in terms of recruiting the Irish into the abolitionist movement, mainly because of these particular, I talk about it in detail in my book, so I won't go into it because we don't have the time here. So if you're interested, you can look at that. But there were also other immigrants coming from Europe, especially refugees from the revolutions, the European revolutions of the 1830s earlier on, and then the 1848 revolutions that sought to overturn monarchical aristocratic systems and establish republics in Europe. And there was some sort of natural sympathy for these people, of course, by the United States, which was a republic, and looked down on the old world and its old world oppressions. But a lot of these refugees, Italian, German, etc., who became very sympathetic to the abolitionist movement, especially the Germans. And the German immigrants tended to join abolitionist societies. Many of them were very radical in their ideas. Some were feminists, some were socialists. They came with all these ideas, progressive ideas. And so there seemed to be some sort of natural overlap between them. So when it comes to the relationship between labor and abolition, we have to be very particular on who we are looking at, what we are talking about. But on the whole, I found the abolitionist movement to develop serious critiques of early capitalism, particularly industrial capitalism, and also serious critiques of the use of wage labor and against nativism and against immigration, against the oppression of immigrants also in this country. So I completely upended that narrative, or at least I hope I did. Maybe a lot of people don't, but the book has a lot of footnotes and a lot of research in it because I felt that I was arguing against the standard conventional wisdom of the relationship between abolition and labor and capitalism. Going from there, one can see how these abolitionist critiques influence national politics, especially the politics of anti-slavery. And here are the ways in which many of these ideas that abolitionists developed feed into the politics of anti-slavery. You have, after the Mexican War, a real conversation going on in the major political parties about slavery. There are other things that I talk about, the gag rule, etc. Anti-abolitionist mobs in the North. I'm not going to go into all that. Again, it's all in my book if you're interested. But I was really interested in looking at how abolitionist critiques of industrial capitalism and of slavery fed into mainstream anti-slavery politics. And one of the most important critiques was, in fact, that link that I talked about, the production of raw cotton in the slave labor grown raw cotton in the South, and how it was feeding many of these early mills, in textile mills in New England. And conscience wigs like the great Charles Sumner, abolitionist senator, eventually from the United States. You may have, he's been in the news recently because his portrait was pictured in the sort of mob that attacked Capitol Hill with the Confederate battle flag. Charles Sumner's portrait was right above that man, and a lot of people were taken aback because Sumner, of course, is known for his abolitionist views. In any case, Sumner and others talked about this unholy alliance between what they call the lords of the loom and the lords of the lash. Lords of the loom, the textile mills; lords of the lash, slaveholders. And they talked about this economic connection, and they pointed out that most of the sort of cotton wigs, the big textile mill owners, most of the elite in New England were very anti-abolitionists and very pro-slavery because of these very profitable economic relationships that they had with the slave economy in the South. And they tended to be very conservative on issues of slavery, fugitive slave rendition, a whole list of issues, Black rights, you could just name them all. The Whigs, the party that disappeared after the sectional conflict over slavery between North and South. A lot of conscience Whigs, as they were called, anti-slavery Whigs, developed this. John Quincy Adams, you think of other conscience Whigs from Vermont, from New York and New England. Amongst the Democrats, which was again leaning very South and becoming very pro-Southern, and it was gradually becoming a very pro-slavery party, would become the party of white supremacy in the 19th century. So everything you know about the party system, just flip it for the 19th century. There were a few Democrats, anti-slavery Democrats, who really condemned what they call the unholy alliance between the money power of the North and the slave power of the South. And they also talked about this connection. Where are they getting all these ideas from? It's from the abolitionists who first talked about it. And of course, this eventually becomes Lincoln's idea of a house divided against itself cannot stand. That's from the Bible, his famous speech, A House Divided, in the 1850s, when you have the emergence of an anti-slavery Republican Party. And that's the third party system that we live in. But of course, in the 19th century, the Republican Party was the party of racial liberalism, of anti-slavery, of big government, of big federal government. So this idea also comes from the abolitionists. In fact, I found a Quaker abolitionist who had first said this before Lincoln. And it seems to me a lot of the ideas that Lincoln uses in his speech, and I've written a lot on abolitionists and Lincoln, you can see how they are first articulated by abolitionists. You can trace the link. He himself, of course, is not an abolitionist. He's a moderate anti-slavery politician. But the way these ideas make themselves into mainstream anti-slavery political parties is important. It's important to see that connection and not to dismiss abolitionists as some sort of radical fanatic minority that had no influence in Northern politics. No, without the abolition movement, one can't even imagine the emergence of an anti-slavery Republican Party and the election of Lincoln in 1860 to the presidency. They adopted what is commonly known, as the historian Eric Foner put it, what was known as the free labor ideology. Sometimes my students get confused. Free labor, they think labor for free. No, free labor meant that you have not enslaved labor. You believe that labor should be free. And it was based on certain notions of the dignity of labor, But it was also based on this idea that labor should eventually become independent, that they should not be dependent on wage labor. They should not be dependent on someone else, the way enslaved people were forced to be dependent on slaveholders. And the free labor ideology was that somehow wage labor was not a permanent condition, that it was a way station, that you would ultimately own your own shop, you would own your own farm, that you would become an independent, productive citizen of the republic. That is what where political virtue came from. Of course, this was all only for men at that time, that you would be an independent economic producer, that you would not be a dependent wage laborer. Unfortunately, that was increasingly not the reality in the North. Lincoln was one of those big advocates of free labor, but increasingly in the North, people were stuck in dependent wage labor and many times oppressive conditions because you didn't have that many unions. Strikes were seen as illegal. You had people stuck in that situation quite a bit in the North. But again, as I said, on the eve of the Civil War, the free labor ideology still resonated for a lot of people because the North, like the South at that time, was predominantly agrarian. But the Southerners developed their own notions of why slavery was the best system, just as the North is talking about free labor and the economically independent producer as the ideal to aspire to. Southerners, by the eve of the Civil War, are saying slavery is a positive good, that in fact, slavery is the best system of labor, that you should actually enslave all labor. Senator James Henry Hammond of South Carolina famously called them mudsills. He says, "You have your mudsills," he said in Congress, "and we have our mudsills. Our mudsills are slave labor, and yours is wage labor." That we have far more in common, that we can have an intersectional alliance between industrial capitalists, merchant capitalists, big money in the North. And this was the other side of the abolitionist critique. Literally, it was the pro-slavery side, that your mudsills and our mudsills can be, doing their work. And in fact, you should sympathize with us slaveholders, that we keep labor under control in ours, and you can keep your labor under control too by adopting our forms. This completely went against notions of the inherent dignity of labor that Lincoln talked about, the fact that labor is prior to capital, etc. So in fact, in the 1860 election, some of the slogans that people adopted were, a lot of working people, a lot of laboring class people who may not even have joined the abolition movement, came out for the new anti-slavery Republican Party, its free labor ideology, its ideas of the dignity of labor. And one of the main slogans, and I came across this, posters that I saw when I went to Springfield in Illinois, that one of the main posters that they had was "Greasy Mechanics," as working class people were called then, and "Mudsills for Abe Lincoln." This was a popular poster that they circulated. And you can see how the Republican Party, which is literally born in 1854, has a great showing in 1856 with Fremont on its president. And by the second presidential elections, Lincoln is elected with a majority of the votes in the North, with every county, not just all the states, but every county in New England giving Abraham Lincoln a decisive majority. So this is not a party that is just appealing to big business or the bourgeoisie. This has a real grassroots connection with working class people. And it's much later that we see the transformation of the Republican Party from the party of anti-slavery to the party of big business after the fall of Reconstruction, after Civil War, with the takeoff of industrial capitalism in the North. At this point, the Republican Party's main identity is that of an anti-slavery party. And if we go further, and I'm put up my first book because this is what I argued in the first book, where I studied pro-slavery ideology and the reasons that Southerners are giving at this time, people like Hammond in his famous Mudsill speech. Why are they in fact seeing the South as completely distinct from the North. It's slavery, of course, but what does that mean in terms of politics and the economy? In terms of politics, they see themselves as an openly anti-democratic force, as you know, Calhoun's ideas of nullification and secession were recipes for minority rule, and that's why most of the Deep South states secede because of the election of a president. I mean, the last time we had a domestic insurrection because of the election of a president was at the start of the Civil War with the election of Lincoln, when 7 Deep South states seceded from the Union rather than accept the results of a perfectly lawful, fair, democratic election where Lincoln won. And so, economically, also, they are arguing at that time that in fact what the North is doing is suicidal economically. They famously bragged, "Cotton is king," because it's our cotton that global capitalism revolves around. It's our cotton that feeds the mills in Britain. It's our cotton that feeds the mills in New England. Without us, you will be economically wiped out. They bragged about that on the eve of the war. And a lot of people saw it that way. They didn't realize that the North's free economy, that the North's own diversified economy, it may be that the South was more profitable, but on the eve of the Civil War, the North was far more diversified economically, which is what, in a way, fuels the Civil War effort. It's not just the fact that the North is more populous and stronger, because we know that that necessarily is not a decisive factor in wars, especially after the Vietnam War. But it's really a matter of the way the North is able to use its diversified economy and the way the South isn't, because it just specializes in the staple crop cultivation that feeds the world market. So once the Union blockades the South, that's the end of its dominance of the world economy. But there are Tories, there are big banking houses and big manufacturing concerns in Britain that are leaning towards recognizing the Confederacy because of these enduring economic ties with the slave economy. And they're actually on the verge, virtually, of recognizing the South before the Emancipation Proclamation. And I put this big quote that I will not read to you, I'll let you read it on your own, that the International Workingmen's Association, socialist organization founded by Marx himself, sent to Abraham Lincoln in 1861. And Lincoln replied to them. He had his ambassador, Charles Francis Adams, in London, reply to them and say, yes, I am for the cause of labor, while these people are, and clearly in England, you have a cotton famine created by the Civil War. The factories are shuttered, and the people who suffer the most, of course, are the working class people who are not getting their wages because they are no longer working. But increasingly, in all these states, places like Manchester, labor organizations come out for the union, while a lot of the conservative press, like the Times of London, and a lot of the big manufacturers come out for the Confederacy. So you can see this scenario being sort of played out, these economic connections between industrial capitalism, slavery, abolition being played out during the Civil War. That was one side of it, right? On the other side was the horrible 1863 draft riots in New York City. New York City, which is like a copperhead city, very pro-South. It's shipping, it's insurance, it's banking, very dependent. Wall Street, very dependent on Southern slave economy. Garrison wrote a famous condemnation of Wall Street that I would sometimes begin my lectures in Britain by quoting Garrison. And that was, I think, in 2016 when the presidential elections, the primaries were going on then. And many times people thought I was quoting Bernie Sanders because he sounded like it, because Garrison talked about how the stones that have built up Wall Street are as hard-hearted as, it was a real critique of finance capitalism and the connections between slavery and Wall Street. And he names Wall Street. But in any case, there was another side to this, and this is this kind of competitiveness that had grown between the abolition and the labor movement. And the worst, and there were, many of these riots took place before in the antebellum era, attacks on abolitionists, on African American churches and communities and schools. But the worst, of course, was the 1863 Draft Riots, mainly by an immigrant Irish working class, protesting the draft to the Union, but also protesting emancipation becoming a Union war aim. And, it was an unfortunate, because they had legitimate grievances in terms of the working conditions that they faced, the fact that they were being drafted into the Union Army. But unfortunately, instead of using this to develop a critique of the people who were exploiting them, it became a racist frenzy where they simply attacked and killed Black people in New York City, especially Manhattan. In fact, it was so bad that the Black population in Manhattan actually fell and did not recover for a long time after the riot, because so many people were killed and simply fled. Many of them fled to Brooklyn. Many of them were sort of given safe haven by abolitionists and by these German Turnvereins that were these gymnastic orders that were part of the abolition movement. But the 1863 Draft Riots was one of the worst and visceral demonstrations of racism in this country. And besides the slaveholders' rebellion, the second largest domestic insurrection in the United States, they killed so many people. They burned to the ground the colored orphanage. They attacked the homes of prominent abolitionists, Republican Party people. New York City itself, as I said, had bankers and shippers and big capitalists like August Belmont, who were very pro-democratic. The mayor of New York, Fernando Wood, actually wanted to secede and join the Southern Confederacy with New York City. So the Democratic Party was very pro-Southern, very pro-slavery. All these factors played into the Draft Riots. It was really a bad instance of racism and domestic insurrection. It was so bad that Lincoln had to send returning troops from Gettysburg to New York City to put down this insurrection that was highly racist. So you can see that the relationship between abolition, slavery, and capitalism is complicated, and certainly a lot of people saw the Civil War as a democratic war, as a war against people who had literally enslaved labor, slaveholders, and there were others who, part of the working class themselves, who scapegoated Black people for their own oppressions, and that has been also a part of the history of race, labor, and democracy in this country. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now so that we have time for some questions. I'm sorry, I think I went on for too long. There was supposed to be 15 minutes for question and answer, so I apologize. I plan to speak only for 30 or 40 minutes, but I guess I tend to get carried away. But sorry about that, but happy to take any questions and comments.
Yeah, no worries. That was great. Thank you, Dr. Sinha. That was tremendous. A lot of ground covered there. And I know I can highly recommend your book, The Slave's Cause. A tremendous amount of work went into that, I'm sure. I can only imagine how much amount of work went into that. And so definitely well worth the time to sit down and read. We did have a few questions come into the chat. And again, if you do have some questions, if you'd like to type those in the chat and we can kind of moderate the discussion here. But the first one that came into the chat was from Kate Gorman. And they asked, how does insurance play into all of this besides insuring slaves?
That's a good question. So the insurance industry, when it starts, they do insure slaves. It's not as if it's it's the only thing they insure, because they are insuring other things. But if you think about the value, how valuable slave property is, it becomes one of their most profitable ways of doing business. Let's put it that way. So the insurance industry in Britain really takes off because they insure ships that are trading in slaves from Africa to the Americas. And Britain, of course, starts dominating the slave trade. In fact, if you go even today and you'll see buildings of the Bank of England or some of the old insurance houses, they literally have columns of African slaves in front of their buildings. You can still see that. So they knew where their money was coming from. There was a famous case of the Zong massacre, in which the ship captain, the enslaved population in the ship became ill. They were, diseased, and he just threw them all overboard and then claimed insurance on them. And that became a famous court case. In the United States, insurance companies not mainly insured slaves as property for slaveholders, but in the slave trade, in particular the domestic slave trade, they also insured these slaves. So one of the famous cases of insurance that went up into the court systems was the Creole slave rebellion. That was a domestic slave trade. It was a ship called Creole that was going from Norfolk, Virginia to New Orleans. The slaves rebelled and they steered the ship to British West Indies, where they knew they would be free because Britain had already abolished slavery by that time. This case came up in court cases in the South because the traders tried to get insurance for the slave rebels, who then just went to the West Indies and became free. They tried to get insurance on these, and the insurance industry said, well, we won't give you the money back because or we won't give you your insurance policies because this was a case of rebellion and there is no insurance against rebellion. So it was mainly their connection of the insurance industry with slavery was mainly through the insurance of enslaved people. But they were very much tied into also the business practices and the marketing in terms of the slave trade in particular, not just slaves and slavery in the plantation, but it's the slave trade. And that helped the industry grow and develop. So if you go to the records of R.G. Dunn and Company in the Harvard Business School that has them right now, you can see how they are developing their best business practices because of their involvement in slavery and the slave trade.
Excellent. Thank you for that. And Bonnie, if anybody direct messaged you with any questions too, feel free to hop in here at any point. So you did do a lot of talking about the comparisons between slave labor and wage labor. And I was listening to a podcast, and I think it was Christy Clark Pajaro, another pretty well-noted speaker on these topics, was talking about the value of slave labor and wage labor system to the wage labor system. And the quote was something like, it provides a foil that allows all other work to somehow seem legitimate precisely because it's not slavery, more or less. So kind of like we have this baseline of it's better than slavery. So I'm wondering if you could kind of elaborate a little bit more on that. And you talked a little bit about Marx and some of the other labor movements. But I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on that relation between the slave labor and the wage system and how that affected some of the unionization at the time.
Yeah, that's a interesting question, because it's a very old and conventional idea. It's not new. It began with some early labor historians like Alan Dawley, in particularly, who studied New England class and community, and they argue that the whole slavery thing it was a distraction for labor, because it helped industrialists say, oh, at least we're not as bad as slaveholders, right? And that these people actually, that somehow the Civil War completely distracted labor from its demands. That's Alan Dawley's interpretation. I read these early labor US historians, and I was astounded at their short-sightedness, because even Marx said, you can't have a labor movement in the United States unless labor in black skin is liberated. He says that clearly. Labor in white skin in the United States will never be liberated unless labor in black skin is. And Karl Marx says this in his Capital volumes, right? And labor itself had different ideas. So if you go to Lynn, I would encourage you all to go and look at the labor movement in Lynn, look at the labor movement in Lowell. They don't see it that way. A lot of them are seeing so a lot of the new work done by newer labor historians, but that argument was made in the 1980s. But if you look at the work by Mark Lowes, in particular, Free Labor, his book, or you look at Thomas Dublin's work, in particular on the Lowell Mill Girls, you will see that this argument is something that they completely challenge also, mainly because these people were so pro-slavery. Most of the cotton Whigs, most of the owners, they're not running around with the abolitionists. They hate the abolitionists. People like Winthrop and the Lawrences and the Appletons, they just can't stand Sumner and Phillips and Garrison. They look down upon them. So it's rather astounding to me that this ideological argument is made that somehow wage labor is legitimized by critiquing slave labor. It's also putting slavery into that box that Genovese put it in. It had nothing to do with the rest of American history. That somehow the struggles of slaves is not labor history. That somehow slave labor is feudal. It's out of capitalism. And I think that argument and that perspective has been challenged really convincingly by the historians whom I have mentioned. I think the links Bonnie has put up for all of you in the chat, particularly people like Ed Baptist and Sven Beckert, who have said that slavery was not the sideshow. And the tragedy for me actually is those labor leaders who bought into the racism, who said, our cause is more important. Because what abolitionists did say was, yes, you're oppressed, but no, slavery is worse. So it's not as if it was legitimizing wage labor, but what it did was create the sense of competitiveness, who's more oppressed. Instead, I found that most abolitionists are talking about it in terms of overlapping oppressions. So what I found was that those abolitionists who are fighting against slavery are at the same time involved with the Chartist movement in Britain, or criticizing the condition of the Irish peasantry by the British. And that's why they developed such strong connections with Irish abolitionists, that they are pacifists, they are feminists, some of them are communitarians, utopian socialists. They're all these overlapping causes that they believe in. So this notion that somehow big business was anti-slavery, firstly, is wrong, because they come to anti-slavery really late. It's really, as Mark Lowes argues in his several books that he has published in the last 10 years, that, so the whole Dawley synthesis, that idea, has been really overturned in recent labor history. And I, in my own work, argue that this kind of tentative ideological connection actually is not even true. It makes sense if you think about it, but there are just not that many big businessmen in the North who are necessarily anti-slavery. In fact, most of them are very pro-slavery. because of these connections. That the real mass anti-slavery vote comes from ordinary farmers, comes from ordinary artisans. It does not come from big business that tends to be very much part of the Democratic Party at this point.
Excellent. Thank you for that. There was an allusion made to the Know Nothing Party in the chat. So I was wondering if you could just elaborate a little bit more on who the Know Nothings were and how they kind of fit into this.
That's a great question, and I talk more about it in my book. So once you have the collapse of the second party system and the Whig Party kind of virtually disappears after the so-called Compromise of 1850, because Southern and Northern Whigs simply can't agree on anything to do with slavery. And the Whig Party sort of disappears. It creates a vacuum in the North because the Democratic Party is there, but it's very Southern leaning. It's a very Southern leaning party. And in this vacuum step up two new parties. One is a nativist party, the Know Nothing Party. It's anti-immigrant, basically, and it's mainly directed against Irish and German Catholic immigrants. They see this as a threat. It's anti-Catholic. It has a little secretive order. That's why they're called Know Nothing, because you're supposed to say you know nothing, right? It later on becomes the American Party, right? And it fields a candidate under the American Party. Now, what happens, especially in Massachusetts, is that the Know Nothing Party becomes really popular. They take over the state government. Actually, they win, and its basic ideology is anti-immigrant. Now, the Republican Party has also emerged at this time as an anti-slavery party, especially after the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act that repealed the Missouri Compromise. So the Republican Party and the Know Nothing Party are competing with each other to become the next dominant party against the Democratic Party. And there are a lot of anti-slavery people in Massachusetts who go into the Know Nothing Party. And the Know Nothing Party actually is able to use anti-slavery arguments too, by saying things like, oh, the fugitive slave rendition is done mainly by the Irish, particularly the Irish Marshal who's killed in one of the fugitive slave rebellions in Boston. So they make anti-slavery and nativist arguments together, but they also do good things. They desegregate the Boston school system. Right? That was one big achievement of the so-called nativists. But when the Republican Party starts emerging as the more dominant force, where people realize that what is really appealing to most Northerners at this time is not nativism, it's anti-slavery. And by 1855, the Know Nothing Party breaks up because the Southern Know Nothings are pro-slavery and the Northern Know Nothings are anti-slavery. So like the Whig Party, they break up over the issue of slavery. The Republican Party then has to deal with this issue of nativism, right? And Lincoln and Sumner, and they say, we want to have nothing to do with nativism. You know, we have a huge German population that is staunchly Republican. They, in fact, have German language newspapers appealing to German immigrants. So they don't want to have much to do with the Know Nothing agenda. And Lincoln says this. He says, first we began by saying all men are created equal. Now we say all men are created equal, but not Black people. Now the Know Nothings want to say all men are created equal, but not Catholics and immigrants. You know, in the end, he says we're going to end up as an aristocracy. And as Lincoln famously, you know, he's so good with his logic. He says that when it comes to this, he calls it the base alloy of hypocrisy. He says, I'd rather immigrate to Russia where they make no pretense of loving aristocracy. So the Republican Party sees the Know Nothings as a competing party. A lot of old political historians said that, you know, the Republican Party simply subsumed the Know Nothing Party and adopted their nativist views. No, the Republican Party goes out of its way to reject the Know Nothing agenda of nativism and their anti-Catholicism because of John Fremont, right? He was the first Republican Party presidential candidate in 1856. So they want to reject religious bigotry. They want to reject the sort of nativist agenda. And so as Tyler Anbinder who I went to graduate school with, actually, argues in his very good book, Nativism and Slavery, where he really examines the rise of know-nothingism and how it collapses very suddenly. It never really becomes a major party. It's really the Republican Party that becomes the anti-slavery party, and they do so for the most part by rejecting know-nothingism. Now, there is a debate amongst historians on this, but I tend to agree with Ann Binder's interpretation on this.
Excellent. Well, thank you so very much, Dr. Sinha. I'm just looking at the time, and I want to be respectful of all your time. So if folks would like to hang around for a little bit after, have a little more informal conversation here, we can continue that after. But I would just like to, on behalf of the National Historical Park and the Heritage Corridor, thank you so very much for speaking to us today, Dr. Sinha. This was a fantastic presentation. And I'm sure everyone enjoyed it. And thank all of you for joining us today. A great turnout again. 72 people at our peak, which is awesome. It makes me very excited. Bonnie will be sending along, expect an email from her about a survey about this presentation and providing a bibliography and a link to the recording of this presentation. So be on the lookout for that from her. In a few days. Our next presentation will be in 2 weeks from today on February 20th, same time at 2 p.m. And Ranger Andrew Schnetzer will be joining us to discuss the legacies of Monticello and Slater Mill, and to talk a little bit more about the legacies of capitalism and King Midas's curse, as he has so appropriately and interestingly named it. So we look forward to seeing all of you then. So thank you, everybody. I hope that you enjoy the weather. Get outside today before it snows tomorrow. We hope to see you back here in 2 weeks.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Bye, Ma.